lapel mic. There we go. What we're hearing right there, again, without going into great detail, is that God is creating boundaries for divorce. And it's fair to ask the question on this side of the New Testament, well, I thought divorce would always be bad. Why wasn't it more strict? And that's a good question. And there are many theories about that I'm not going to go into. But what I want us to understand is that God here is restricting divorce. God values marriage, and that divorce, if it should happen, and it doesn't go into at all what are the reasons for a legitimate divorce, but it just says that there needs to be a reining in of divorce, a set of boundaries, because God values and upholds marriage. And he does it in such a way, particularly here, to protect the wife, to protect the woman, and reduce the mistreatment of women, which was so common and rampant in culture at that time. Now, what we know in the New Testament is that God, through Jesus, God as Jesus in the New Testament, restricts even more divorce and says that there is no valid reason for divorce except infidelity. And so in doing so, God in the New Testament is showing his value and the importance of upholding the commitment and covenant of marriage. Second, verse 5. When a man, also talking about marriage here, when a man is newly married, he shall not go out with the army or be liable for any other public duty. He shall be free at home 1 year to be happy with his wife whom he has taken. Now at that time, when there were times of battle or war, many nations would say, any able-bodied male, you go and fight. We're fighting for the protection of our nation. But God here, in upholding marriage, and young married folks especially, says you need to take a year, men, to be with your wife, to learn and appreciate one another, to savor the love that you have for one another, and not go to war. Verse 6, no one shall take a mill or an upper millstone in pledge, for that would be taking a life in pledge. In other words, if you are a person in need and you need money, which was very common, if disaster came upon you and your farm, you could go to a neighbor maybe who was doing better and borrow money from them or borrow grain. And it wasn't uncommon for you to leave collateral, or for the person to take from you some collateral for the repayment of that loan. But he's saying, don't take something from that person in collateral that their life depends on, which would be tempting because then you could guarantee that they would be pretty hurried up to pay you back. Don't do that. Why? Because they're dependent upon this for their very living. That goes too far. It's unjust. It's restricting the powerful and protecting the poor. Verse 7. If a man is found stealing one of his brothers of the people of Israel, and if he treats him as a slave or sells him, then that thief shall die. So you shall purge the evil from your midst. Again, just like it sounds, taking another person, stealing, kidnapping a person to use as a slave is great evil before God. And the person who does it, no questions asked, are deserving of death. Verse 8. Take care in a case of leprous disease to be very careful, and you already heard this, to do according to all that the Levitical priest shall direct you. As I commanded them, so you shall be careful to do. Remember what the Lord your God did to Miriam on the way as you came out of Egypt. And so here he is giving a motivation. Okay, I wouldn't say it's the only motivation, but it's a motivation. And that's grace. And you might think, well, how is that grace? Like the threat of leprosy? That doesn't sound very gracious. Well, think of it this way. If I tell one of my children when they were young not to play with matches, But I know that they have a tendency to disobey and to be fascinated with matches. And I say to them, do not play with matches, or you will get a spanking, or you will get sent to timeout, or you will lose your screen time later today. That is grace. Why? Because it's encouraging them to do what is meant for their flourishing and for their good. And so for God here, as he often does in the Old and New Testament, to say, hey, do what is right, do what is good, and in order to encourage you to move away from what is harmful for you and for those around you, this is a negative consequence. That's grace. Verse 19 to 22. Or sorry, this is 10 to 13. When you make your neighbor a loan of any sort, you shall not go into his house to collect his pledge. You shall stand outside, and the man to whom you make the loan shall bring the pledge out to you. So pausing there, he's saying if you go and somebody owes you money and you go to collect, don't go barging into their house. Don't use intimidation or manipulation or use fear to extract what they owe you. Be polite. Honor them. Treat them with dignity. And let them come out to bring it to you. Continuing on in that same vein, and if he is poor, if he is a poor man, so the man who owes you money, if he is a poor man, you shall not sleep in his pledge. You shall restore him the pledge as sun sets, that he may sleep in his cloak and bless you. And it shall be righteousness for you before the Lord your God. So one of the most valuable things that a person could have at that time, is this still working, Greg? Yep. One of the most valuable things a person could have was their cloak, right? It's not like us where you go into anybody, probably most of our closets, and you see a whole line of coats or shirts and pants. They would have one, maybe two cloaks to keep them warm throughout the day, but also they would sleep in those clothes. So they didn't have, a cloak and a blanket, but it served both as a cloak through the day in public, but also a blanket at night to keep them warm. And the cloak, because it had that value, but it wasn't like a millstone that their life depended on, that was a great thing to use as a pledge, as collateral when you owed somebody money. And so it would be the thing oftentimes that the loaner would receive from the loanee, a cloak as a pledge. But he's saying this, but don't keep the pledge, the cloak, overnight, right? Take it back to them in the evening so they can use it to sleep with. And then in the morning you could go collect it back again. Again, here we have God giving them laws that are favorable to the poor and restrictive of those who are in positions of power or money. Verse 14, you shall not oppress a hired worker who is poor and needy, whether he is one of your brothers or one of your sojourners who are in your land and within your towns. You shall give him his wages on the same day before the sun sets, for he is poor and counts on it, lest he cry against you to the Lord and you be guilty of sin. So the command here is for those who are in positions of power, and you have people who are working for you on the farm. Treat them with dignity. Treat them with respect. And when they work for you, pay them not only fairly, but pay them quickly, because they're dependent upon it. And it's easy for us to forget that because many of us, maybe not all, most of us have bank accounts, and if we're short on cash, we can have some to carry us through. But there are many, even in our society today, who live hand to mouth and are dependent upon being paid quickly. And he's saying, treat your servants fairly and pay them because they're dependent upon you for their financial security. Verse 16, fathers shall not be put to death because of their children, nor shall children be put to death because of their fathers. Each one shall be put to death for his own sin. So again, to to consider fairly and justly our treatment of one another in the justice system. That we cannot punish children because of the failure of their fathers, or because of the failure of the children to settle the debt, to make what has been done, make it right. We can't take it out on the parents. Verse 17, you shall not pervert the justice due to the sojourner or to the fatherless, or take a widow's garment in pledge. But you shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. Therefore I command you to do this. So don't treat those outside of the community. And this is a very strong temptation, right? It's easy to love those who are in our community that we know. There's an accountability. First of all, we know them, they know us. If we do them wrong, we have the chance that it may come back on us. But also, we've logged time with one another. We're familiar with one another, so we don't do each other right. But if some outsider comes in, many of us can be suspicious or cynical about that. And in our practice, in our treatment, to be unfair. But he says, no, you treat the sojourner, the immigrant, the refugee, the outsider with fairness and just laws. And so also for the widow's garment, don't take a widow's garment in pledge. She needs that. Today we have many systems. Even we heard today from Miss Wright about the system of government that is set up to care for those who are in need. Social justice. Well, at that time, there weren't programs that were set up in the same way. And a widow was in great need. She didn't have a husband to care for her. Don't take her garment in pledge. Verse 19. When you reap your harvest in your field and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back and get it. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat your olive trees, you shall not go over them again. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow. When you gather the grapes of your vineyard, you shall not strip it afterward. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore I command you to do this. So what we hear again is the intentionality from those especially who are outside, or those who are going through hard times, the orphan, the widow, the sojourner, that when we are going about our business, when we are managing our farm, that we would not make sure that we get every jot and tittle, every crumb of fruit or of grain so that we can make a good profit, but we are purposely, intentionally leaving things behind to provide for those who are in need. Leave some harvest for the widow. Leave some harvest for the widow and the orphan and the sojourner. Do not be greedy, but share with those who are in need. Now to chapter 25, the first 4 verses. If there is a dispute between men and they come into court and the judges decide between them, acquitting the innocent and condemning the guilty, then if the guilty man deserves to be beaten, and the judge shall cause him to lie down and be beaten in his presence with a number of stripes in proportion to his offense. 40 stripes may be given him, but not more, lest if one should go on to beat him with more stripes than these, your brother be degraded in your sight. So there is the allowance and the exhortation here for punishment for crime, but that it needs to be adjudicated properly. You just can't be mad at somebody because they did you wrong and go out in anger and bring punishment upon them. Rather, it has to be properly brought to court with judges who decide. It was set up by God that there would be a judicial system to look at the evidence, to assess it. And then when it was determined who was guilty, there would be punishment, but a punishment that was even to the crime. It was proportionate. It was fair. And not overly degrading or harmful. There were limits to the power of the court. Verse 4, you shall not muzzle an ox when it is treading out the grain. So on top of fairness and just activity being given for humans, also here we hear that justice needs to be given to God's creatures. So when an ox is working hard, it was not uncommon for some to muzzle it so it wouldn't eat the grain while it was working, while it was doing its work. He says, no, don't do that. It needs to eat. Let it eat. In the New Testament, this same passage is used to describe not just animals, but to people, to allow humans to enjoy benefits from the work that they're doing. Specifically talking about pastors. Let pastors and elders receive remuneration, financing for the work that they're putting into the gospel ministry. So in all these things, all these laws, these 12 laws, what we're hearing is that God has a way, God has a standard by which His creation should work. He is the one who decides what is right and what is wrong. These are principles that He intends His people to live by going into the new world, going into Canaan, as they prepare to settle into the country and decide how to operate it. He gives them instruction that is meant for their good. And we can summarize it by saying, hey, care for those who are weak. Care for the poor. Don't take advantage of those who are in hard circumstances, but bend over backwards to make sure they're taken care of. Those who have much, that is a blessing from God. Use that to benefit those who are struggling. Even today we've heard of somebody, a family, already in hard times, have experienced a fire in their home and are displaced. We have been given much, and we're called to use that to serve those who are in tough circumstances, to care, even for the animals, and to care for women. At that time, women in much of the world were considered not much better than property, existing for men's pleasure or their men's administration. No. Protect, provide, cherish the women as created equal by God. The problem with this is Israel would not follow these laws. Israel continually sought their pleasure. Israel, those in power, took advantage of those who were weaker. And if you look at church history, if you've ever read a book on church history, it's mostly painful about how the church historically, over and over and over again, has taken advantage of those who are weak, have oppressed the orphan, the widow, and the sojourner. Men have used Scripture to oppress women in their lives, one race over another. Those in positions of authority, taking advantage of those in weakness. We could think, if we took some time to see just a cursory glance of the history of God's people, has been one of abuse and oppression. Now, of course, there are plenty of things as well that we can point to the church as having done well and doing good things. But even in small ways, recently, I have seen God's people take advantage of the others around them or fail to use the blessing of their life to benefit others. I remember just thinking about this, the command to leave behind some of the grain or the fruit for the poor. I used to work in college. I worked at a Christian retreat center in North Carolina, and I was working in the kitchen. And there were hundreds of people that would come through every weekend, and there was delicious food. And I remember because I was always so hungry, and I'd be serving this food. And afterwards, it was told to us very strongly, it was like, you cannot eat this food afterwards. You can pay for it. We'll give it to you half off, which was fine. But they said, all the rest of it, you put in buckets and take it out and dump it. I mean, I remember one day being so hungry and just having vats of golden, delicious fried chicken just sitting there. And so bad, I just wanted to eat it. Or take it or give it away, but we had to take it out back and just dump it in the trash can. We live in a culture that has so much food that gets thrown away, while there are many in our country even, and across the globe, that are starving. Part of the work of following God, of being a believer in Yahweh, means to consider those who are hungry, consider those who are poor, consider those who are weak, consider those who are different, and to treat them with care and love. These are principles that we draw from these old laws, and we apply them even today as a church living in a broken world. That is the horizontal aspect of what it means to do the right thing. Let me ask you a trivia question. Don't get your phones out. What is the happiest country to live in? What is the happiest country, Jay? Nope. Sweden? Nope. Close. Finland. Did you look? Okay, Sarah, man. Yeah, I wouldn't have surprised me for you to get Finland. Finland is the happiest place to live in the world, according to a team of social scientists who have created an algorithm and a survey that they send out to thousands of people around the globe, asking basic questions like, how happy are you with your life? And it turns out Finland is the most happiest place to live. Anybody else got a guess on what the least happiest country is to live in? No, North Korea. You know, that's a great guess. Yeah. Afghanistan, according to the survey. Afghanistan. We want to be better people. And we want to have a better society. And we should want St. Louis to be a better place for people to live. As Christians, we should want our country to be a happy place. But the only way that is going to be a happy place is by living according to the one who created it in the first place. He knows how it's supposed to operate. And so horizontally, that is important. However, this team of social scientists were not asking questions that have very much to do with human happiness. And that's our vertical understanding of what it means to do the right thing. We have to consider that these laws not only give us something to live by in a world that is a mess, but they also give us something to live by in relationship with God, the one who created all things. And that's what I want to challenge us to think about. How do we think about these laws when it comes to the insight of the one who created these laws? These laws give us a sense of who God is, but they also give us access to the heart of God. These laws give us insight into God's holiness. They tell us something about God, right? Not just about humans, but about God. They tell us, they communicate to us. God cares about those who are weak. He cares about those who are in hard circumstances. He cares for a family that has lost their home in a fire. He cares about the outsider who has had to flee their country because of civil war to come to a place of great safety, walking sometime days and weeks on end. He cares about those who are mistreated by their bosses. He cares about those who have taken on debt and are overwhelmed with paying back those debts. He cares that criminals are treated fairly and that the justice system is properly discerning who's guilty. We learn something about God. He is holy. He is merciful. He is compassionate. He is present among His people. And He wants us to reflect that also in how we treat one another. The other thing that we learn that is vertical is that God, through these laws, God gives us access to Himself. So we learn about who He is, and that's good, but just learning about God doesn't give us a relationship to God. These laws actually were kind of like rails on a railroad that gave access to God's people into a relationship to God. God's desire in the Old Testament and in the New Testament is that His people would draw near. You know, one of the things that is interesting for those of you who have young children, one day you're going to send them off to college or to marriage or to a job, and they're going to hopefully leave your home, right? Well, when you do that, there's a special bittersweet pain in your heart when your children go away. You've invested so much into their lives, and now you send them off, and part of you goes with them. But then they come back, and Levi and Isaiah will come back soon to be with us, and we're already thinking about it. And there's something about drawing them near that is special to a parent. Wanting them back in your home and in your presence. God's the same way, and His love for you is far greater than the love of a parent to a child. He wants you to be in His presence. He doesn't want you just to know about Him. He wants you to be with Him. The problem is our sin, our failure to be better people, our failure to follow God's laws. Israel's failure over and over again to obey these commands created a blockade in their relationship to God. And God at any point could have said, nah, you blew it, I'm done with you, be gone. Call down fire from heaven. Gonna start a new world, restart. But God is merciful and compassionate and just. And He said, no, not going to do that. Instead, I'm going to provide a way that you can come into my presence. It still needs to be holiness. So these are the laws, right? And we tend to think of the laws as kind of being these abstract, maybe even random things that God, a checklist, like Ben Franklin's checklist. But these laws are relational. They teach us who God is, but they provide a way to come into His presence. The problem is they failed, and so then He came up with another system. Sacrifices in the temple by priests in order to absolve them from the guilt of not following these laws, in order that they still would be able to access a relationship to Him. This past week, I went on a pastor retreat with a group of men in the Missouri Presbytery, and one of them was a man who I have known for almost 25 years, 23, and he has been a mentor to me, and we got paired up in a discussion group to talk about what God is doing in our life and to share our testimony with each other. And I didn't really know much of his testimony. But he told me, he said, I was raised in a family that, we went to church. He said, and my family was very successful. My dad was a doctor. And he said, and it was communicated to the children, to me, that in order to find pleasure with God and with one another, in order to gain the pleasure and approval of my parents, that I had to be successful, that I had to live a certain way and work a certain way in order to hold on to the pleasure of my parents. And that God was out there, and if God was going to find any pleasure in me, Phil, that I had to live a certain way. I had a checklist of things that was part of my life that I had to attain to be a good citizen and a good worker and a contributor to society. And if I wasn't, then I would receive displeasure. And so I worked hard. He goes, but I always had this internal sense that I wasn't going to be good enough. I wasn't going to do it well enough. I wasn't going to be successful enough to earn my parents' pleasure or God's. And then when he was 19, he was at a church and he heard something new from the pastor. He heard the gospel of grace. He said, I remember it so clearly because my life was transformed. I heard this, that the pleasure of God is not something that I can earn. That I don't have to prove anything to God. I don't merit God's love. But God opens his love up to me as an undeserving human being, despite my failures. He loves me because of what Jesus has done. Jesus has merited what we cannot earn ourselves. Love from God is not through our list of virtues, but it's despite our list of virtues. We don't do the right thing because of what we may earn from God. We do the right thing because of what God has done for us. We don't obey God because we're afraid of leprosy. We obey God because he loved us and has given his Son as a propitiation for our sin. Our sin is laid upon the one perfect human being, Jesus. You know, one of the best things I love about Christianity is that it gives us a place to put our sin. I borrowed this thing from Marcus Whitman. I wish I could say this was 150 pounds, but it's only 45, but it feels like it. When we are trying to do the right thing in order to merit God's approval, we're stacking upon ourselves weights like this. Can you imagine if you lived your life having to walk around carrying something like this? The world, the culture will say, hey, you can't do the right thing. You're not going to be able to do the right thing. But just do the best you can. And who's really to decide what's right and wrong anyway? And in doing that, they're allowing us the honor of being able to carry around our own weight. And by weight, what I mean is not the list of laws, but our failure to keep those laws. Jesus came not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. The guilt is what we get to lay aside. We don't have to live a life carrying the weight of guilt around. Now, what the world will say is, hey, there's nothing wrong, there's nothing there, and just cover it up. And that's what we do. We cover it up. We put on cloaks, we put on coats, we put on blankets to cover it up. I'm okay, we're okay, you're okay. We mask it. We pretend that we're okay. We lie to ourselves that we're really not that bad off, but in reality, we are carrying the weight of our own sin. We're pretending that this isn't part of our lives. But when we follow Jesus, when we receive Jesus as our Savior, what we do is we're taking it off. We're removing it. And we're laying down the burden at the cross of Christ. That's what Christianity gives us. Not a list of rules. Yes, we need to follow Jesus, and if you love me, you'll obey my commands. Absolutely. But the guilt of failure, we lay down at the cross of Christ. He has taken it away from us and given us instead his righteousness. That's the gospel. That's the good news that we can look back on, that the people of Israel looked ahead to. We don't need to live in shame. We don't need to live in guilt, because we have a place to lay that burden down. Let me read this in conclusion, then I'll pray. This is Jesus' words given to his people before he went to the cross. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Jesus, we thank you that you went to the cross and you took the weight that we could not, that is far heavier on our souls than this weight here around my neck. Lord, it is far heavier. And so many of us, Lord, every day are tempted to take it back up, to earn our own salvation, to earn our righteousness. And Jesus, you have taken that weight, you have taken that burden that we are heavy laden with, and given us rest. Thank you that your yoke is easy and your burden is light. Help us to trust this. Lord, I also pray as followers of you, of God, Lord, that we would do better. Because of what you have done, we would be better bosses, better husbands, better wives, better parents, better students, better citizens. Lord, that the way we live would communicate to the world that your way is good. We pray this by your grace, in your name. Amen. Amen. I want to invite you now.